After several hours of a power cut that affected most of Spain and Portugal, electricity is gradually being restored. And the Spanish Prime Minister has told the Spanish people not to panic, not to speculate about the causes, but also not to use their mobile phones unless it's strictly necessary. What has happened in Spain and Portugal, and what are the lessons in the UK if we face a blackout of a similar scale? We'll discuss all of that on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and later we'll be crossing over to Moscow to catch up with Steve Rosenberg to get his take on the Russian side of negotiations over peace in Ukraine, or at the moment, a lack of negotiations. But first of all, as we're recording this episode of Newscast at about 6:45 on Monday evening, power is gradually being restored to parts of Spain and Portugal after an immense power cut that affected most of both those countries starting on Monday lunchtime. And it meant you saw traffic lights stopping working. It meant you saw people being evacuated from trains and no one able to pay for anything by phone or by card because the payments infrastructure went down. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of how people were affected by this enormous power cut. And we had a statement from the Spanish Prime Minister saying that he didn't want to speculate about what the cause of it was, but he did advise people not to travel, only to use their mobile phones if it was strictly necessary, and to not overwhelm the emergency services, which were already pretty whelmed by this huge power cut. Right, it's quite hard to get hold of people in Spain or Portugal, for example, the BBC correspondents there, but we have managed to reach two people in the UK who are real experts on just the business and, well, like the physics of how electricity works on the continent. We're joined now by Rachel Morison, who is energy editor for the Bloomberg news service in Europe. Hello, Rachel.
Hello.
Busy day to be an energy editor in Europe?
Yeah, I don't know where today's gone. It's been very busy.
And you've probably still got many hours of work still to do. Also joining us is Professor Keith Bell, who is Professor of Future Power Systems at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. Hello, Professor Bell.
Hello.
So, Rachel, do you want to just give us a bit of a potted timeline of what your day's been like? When did you first sort of sense that something was going on in the Iberian Peninsula?
Yeah, so I think, got an idea about it pretty quickly after it happened, which was shortly after 12:30, when first of all, we monitor all of the feeds from X and all of those kind of things of the grid operators. So the grid operator had said there had been this problem. Obviously, we have lots of people in our Madrid bureau who also were reporting the same. And then it was all hands on deck, and we started trying to piece together bits and what we could from what's been happening. So I would say that quite a lot of the data from the grid operators, which is where we would hope to find out what exactly has caused this huge blackout, has been quite scant. So that's been challenging. And then, of course, colleagues in Spain and in Portugal not having any electricity is also challenging. So I've been hearing things that people have had no phone reception. Our office does have backup generation, but it only lasts so long. So, they've all been sent home, and then you kind of lose comms. So I think it's been difficult for people inside of Spain to find out what's going on. And in a way, we sort of know more outside of Spain and Portugal about what's actually happening.
And also, Keith, electricity required for pretty much everything in society. But it's interesting to see the things that have emerged as big themes today. It's traffic lights. It's people not knowing whether they can charge their phones, so not being able to use their phones. It's people not needing cash because the electronic payment systems don't work, and a big electrified train network that's ground to a halt.
Yeah, in a sense, it just reminds us of something we should already know, that society is fundamentally dependent on electricity now, and it's not just to do with decarbonisation or electrification. It's been this way for years and years. But the kind of the use of digital systems, like you say, cashless payments, the way we're so dependent on communications. The old landline was still dependent on electricity supplies, but maybe they were kind of vulnerable in different ways. But it's just reminds us of what we already knew.
And I suppose, Rachel, when you've got tens of millions of people affected by a power outage, it's the stuff that people rely on all day, every day that you're kind of going to notice. Maybe bits of the economy and society that aren't as visible, we just haven't heard about yet.
Yeah, I guess so. And I think one of the most difficult things is mobile phone network not being available and internet not being available. So some colleagues have not been able to find out what's happening at home. You know, they came into the office this morning for a day at work and haven't been able to be in touch with their families to know if they're okay or what's happening at home because, you know, your phone isn't working and you can't find any information. So luckily, one colleague lent another one a bike so they could get home to see if their family were all right this afternoon.
Old tech. Well, my love of e-bikes is well known, so I'd be stuffed. Anyway, I should use an old-fashioned push bike. We just had a press conference from Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister, just before we started recording this episode of Newscast on Monday tea time. And he said it's best not to speculate about the causes of this. And Keith, as a responsible academic, you will not want to contribute to misinformation or dodgy theorising. But just looking back the last few years, there have been power outages of this scale elsewhere. What were some of the causes of those?
Yeah, I mean, there's usually something of this scale somewhere in the world every year. And the causes vary sometimes where there is involved. Back in 2003, I think it was sort of early August, that year, high temperatures, as you would expect in the summer in North America. There was a flashover on an overhead line. Unfortunately, at the time, the relevant system operator for that area had lost some of their situational awareness. So they weren't actually, I think, aware of precisely what had happened. They could have managed it. They had time. They had about 2 hours in which they could have reconfigured things and got everything back to a kind of, a nice even keel. But they didn't do that. And eventually another line kind of heated up enough that there was another flashover. And
what's a flashover?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So basically, the one of the key kind of constraints on the power network, you can imagine when current flows, back to physics class lessons at school, current flows, a conductor gets hot. So if you think about, it's underground cable or a transformer or an overhead line, you've got to avoid that conductor getting too hot. So in the case of a transformer, the insulation might break down, and then you kind of got a short circuit, and the current isn't going where it's supposed to go, and the system can become unstable, and it's dangerous. For an overhead line, the conductor expands as it gets hot, and you think about a wire being held at two ends, and the sag in the middle. That sag gets lower and lower. And if you've got something underneath that, normally we're relying on the air to provide the electrical insulation to make sure that the current goes along the wire and not somewhere else. But if that air gap gets too small, there's the possibility of a short circuit. So literally the air is ionized and the current flows through the air down into whatever's underneath. And protection is designed to detect such a condition, and it takes that line out of service for safety and to help with stability. But that line, when it's come out, the power that line was carrying is now being carried by another line or other lines. So they are more heavily loaded. They get hotter than they were. And again, if you don't manage that carefully, if it gets too hot, then that flashes over potentially, and then you get you can get a cascade of things that lots of lines being increasingly heavily overloaded, and you can disconnect one region from another, and then one region hasn't got enough generation, and then you get into another phenomenon of the generation plant can't produce enough to balance out the demand, and then all the voltages collapse, and then that's it. That whole region has gone down.
But Rachel, it's interesting when you dig into the British energy system, they keep saying this word resilient. That whole industry seems quite proud of the fact that the British power network has got all sorts of things in place to make sure this couldn't happen, to avoid it happening, to deal with it if it does happen. Presumably there's going to be huge questions asked about the resilience of the Spanish and Portuguese systems if potentially one thing happening in one place could bring the whole thing down.
Yeah, I think that's what's kind of amazing about this, that we don't know yet what it is, of course, but that it could be something relatively small that causes, as Keith said, this kind of cascading effect. So sometimes being connected to your neighbor when it comes to electricity is a good thing. You're getting power imports and exports when you need them. But then something like this, they can bring you down with them, as kind of happened here. And I think, I mean, the UK, yes, perhaps we can say something on this scale hasn't happened, but it wasn't too long ago that the Heathrow outage caused reasonable amounts of chaos as well, although that was only one airport. But, it's not like we're immune to it. And also, I don't know if you remember in 2019, I've been looking back through these today, there was a big outage in and around London that caused 1 million homes to lose power. And that was a huge deal at the time as well. So maybe we learned lessons from that. I'm not sure. But yeah, it can happen anywhere. And it does. Texas is another example where mainly weather related, extreme cold and extreme heat, that their grid isn't very resilient, and they've come under huge criticism for that and need to find ways to improve that.
Yeah, and the Climate Change Committee here in the UK, who advises the government on their carbon reduction targets, they've got a report coming out this week about adaptation. So what do you need to do to infrastructure and buildings, and actually just on policy terms, to prepare for a world where actually it could be hotter or colder or windier or wetter, and you might have to protect against things like this happening for climate-related reasons. Keith, I'm not going to get you to speculate about, what would happen in the UK if this happened, but I've been reading about this thing called a black start. Explain to us what that is and why people might see lots of speculation about what we'd do in a black start.
Yeah, so it literally comes, the term comes from all the lights going out, so everything's gone dark, and you're trying to start everything up from that shut down, collapsed condition, if you like. So power plant depends on power. So for its controls and pumps and whatever, depending on what kind of plant it is. So there's certain stations that will have specific facilities to kind of restart themselves and then get themselves operating, and then they would connect up a bit of demand into that and kind of bit by bit build it all up. Because that's one of the key things, is balancing generation and demand within quite a small variation. So yeah, it's a difficult process. The system operator here should be practicing that on a regular basis, doing lots of simulations and making sure that all the communications are going well, because they rely on the distribution network companies to reconnect demand as it goes along. They rely on the generation companies who are coming in step by step to build everything back up. So it could take, a number of hours. Back I mentioned in 2003, there was a collapse of the Italian system. And actually, the system operator there got a lot of praise for getting the system back in 24 hours. That was regarded as being very, very good from the entire Italian peninsula going down. And there you were able to benefit from connections over the Alps from neighboring countries. That's less easy for us as an island. Albeit some of the newer high voltage direct current technologies that connect us to some of our neighbours, they are capable of contributing to some of this restoration process.
But Keith, it's interesting reading about this because, as you said, power stations need power to start up again if that's the reason that your power stops in the first place. So, but apparently coal-fired power stations were the best ones for doing that. But we've just switched off all our coal-fired power stations. So what happens now that we're so much more reliant on renewables?
So we'll have to have, we still have for this foreseeable future, for the next kind of number of years, let's say 5 years, 10 years at least, unabated gas-fired power plant as backup. We won't be burning anything like as much gas as we develop the amount of wind and solar capacity. But we'll have access to the gas if and when we need it. So this is one of the kind of examples where you'll be using some of that plant to do that. And actually, if it's windy and it's sunny when you've got to do this process, then in principle you can make use of those resources as well. But you can't guarantee that it's going to be very windy at that particular time when you need it. So that is certainly something that the National Energy System Operator, as it is now, will be looking at and studying very carefully about what the new strategy will be. And it's very much part of their job is to make sure that even though that's never happened to us before, you can never say that it will never happen. So they've got to be ready for it.
And also they have backup plans to actually ration electricity, don't they? So your special things like airports and hospitals and emergency departments get guaranteed power, but everyone else is assigned a letter, and then there's a rota for each postcode about which properties with which assigned which letter get power for 3 hours at a time in the sort of nightmare scenario.
So if you have to go to, that's more of a kind of planned condition. There's also how how you restore demand, who gets priority for coming back. But if they can see an event possibly coming, then yeah, they would be putting into place rotor disconnections. So they were looking at that, I mean, very carefully, very seriously, a couple of winters ago when we were, worried about a shortage of gas. So actually a shortage of gas would most likely have manifested for us in Britain as a shortage of electricity, because one of the ways of rationing gas would be to stop the gas supplies to the power stations. You've got to maintain gas pressures in the gas network for safety reasons. So you've got to kind of use it in the most kind of important directions, let's say. So the electricity system operator was having to think, okay, if we haven't got the gas-fired power stations available, how are we going to manage this? So it's kind of take your pain in turn about this sort of rotor disconnection.
Fascinating. Right, last question for you both. Do you have vivid memories of ever being stuck in a power cut before? Rachel?
No, I've never been in a power cut before, actually. I think once my lights went off, but then it was just that my it was a trip, so it was my fault. So
Okay.
no, I've never.
It wasn't a system-wide issue.
No, I did phone them, but no.
Keith, ever been in a dramatic power cut yourself?
I've not been in a dramatic one. I mean, I've had, kind of temporary interruptions. It felt like I might have been that event in 2019, that Rachel mentioned. I was very quickly trying to work out what was going on, and it almost felt like I was in there trying to sort of understand it and see what was happening and trying to help understand, trying to learn lessons from it afterwards, which I think is always an important thing in these kinds of things. Every event is different, but there are sort of themes that can emerge, and I'm sort of encouraged that system operators globally do talk to each other. They do share lessons with each other. So anytime something happens, it's a bit of kind of there, but for the grace of God. But then you try and learn from what other people have gone through.
And it is interesting looking at the Spanish news websites, like plenty of places in Spain have got electricity restored now, so quicker than the 10 hours that the electricity company was saying earlier in the day. But at the same time, there's still places that don't have any. I've just done a quick search because I remember covering a massive blackout in New York when I was on Newsround on CBBC. And I'm pretty sure that after that, there was a baby boom, or claims of a baby boom, which obviously we wouldn't cover that quite so much on a children's program. And I've just checked, and apparently all this stuff about blackouts leading to baby booms is mythical. It's not backed by statistics. But anyway, we shall see in 9 months in Spain and Portugal. What was that, Keith?
I said it was a good story. Yeah,
exactly. Too good to be true. Keith, thank you very much for your insight.
You're welcome.
And Rachel, I'll let you get back to monitoring the situation. I'm sure you're going to have a long, long night, but thank you for talking to us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Now, as promised, let's get a roundup of what's happening in Moscow in terms of the conflict with Ukraine, because there's been a few developments in terms of people from the US going to see Vladimir Putin. But the latest one is that the Russian president has suggested another temporary ceasefire, at least from the Russian point of view. So the person who can tell us what's been going on with all of that is friend of the podcast, Steve Rosenberg.
Hello, Adam. Good to speak to you.
You too. Good to catch up. It's been a while. Just explain to us then what Russia is actually offering here.
So the Kremlin made an announcement today saying that in early May, basically from the 8th of May to the 10th of May, there will be a 3-day ceasefire in Ukraine, a unilateral ceasefire. That for those 3 days, Russia will cease hostilities. President Putin claims out of humanitarian considerations. And Russia is calling on Ukraine to follow suit. Now, this, of course, follows the other ceasefire, the previous ceasefire that Vladimir Putin had announced. That was the 30-hour ceasefire over Easter. Ukraine, at the time, accused Russia of violating that multiple times. Russia accused Ukraine of basically ignoring it. So what will happen for these 3 days? Well, I mean, Kremlin critics suspect that this is not a genuine attempt to take a step towards peace, that this is an attempt to persuade Donald Trump that Russia is serious about wanting peace, because the Russians can see that Donald Trump is getting impatient, judging by some of the things he's posting on social media, some of the comments he's making. We've heard rare criticism coming from the Trump administration of Vladimir Putin. That's quite unusual. So I think these ceasefires, brief ceasefires, are aimed at trying to persuade the US president that, hey, Russia's the good guy here.
Just on a sort of logistical thing, why those particular dates? Why not, say, tomorrow?
Well, those dates coincide with the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. So President Putin is using this big date, and it's going to be a huge anniversary here. He's using this particular historical anniversary to show that he is a man of peace and announcing this latest ceasefire. Now, this does not go as far as America had wanted or Ukraine had wanted. Do you remember last month, I think it was, that America had been pushing Russia and Ukraine, both of them, to agree to a 30-day unconditional comprehensive ceasefire. Now, Ukraine had agreed to that. Russia did not agree to that, or rather it laid down lots of conditions before it would consider agreeing to that. So what do we get then? This 30-hour Easter ceasefire, now a 3-day ceasefire. This is not the kind of thing that America was looking for. And already we've heard some criticism from the Trump administration. The White House spokesperson has said that Donald Trump actually wants a permanent ceasefire. This does not go far enough.
Yeah, I just wonder, though, is there the optimist in me thinks, well, hang on, if Russia has dropped its preconditions for a much shorter ceasefire, then does that mean there's room for manoeuvre on preconditions for a longer one?
It's unclear. It's unclear. I mean,
I knew as soon as I asked that question, because you
impression
can't sort of have those conversations with the Kremlin to find out the truth of that, can you?
No, I can't pick up my phone and dial Vladimir Putin. He's not on direct dial. But, you know, I read the Russian newspapers here regularly, and I do not get the impression that Moscow is in any hurry to end this war. I just give you a couple of examples from today's papers. There was one, this is Kommersant business paper, and it has a commentator who's linked to the Russian Foreign Ministry, who says that a ceasefire that is only half fulfilled, Moscow's not interested in that. What Moscow wants, and what is vital for Moscow, is a many-fold reduction in the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, it says, and a major reconstruction of the political system of Ukraine. Now, this goes much further, right, than I think the things that America, Russia, Ukraine are discussing at the moment. This sounds like more conditions that Russia is putting down before it ends the war, which I thought was quite interesting. The other thing is, this is a popular paper, Komsomolskaya Pravda, and it today says that officially the Kremlin has made it clear that discussion on getting a peace settlement will continue for as long as necessary. It's in no hurry because they probably will need more time to find a common language. Again, we're hearing from Donald Trump that they were close to a deal. The message you get in the Russian press, the Russian media, is, things may be moving in the right direction, but there's no hurry. And of course, this fuels speculation that because Russia believes it has the initiative on the battlefield, it's in no hurry to end this.
Yeah, to me, that actually sounds like a hardening up of Russia's position on the substance and on the process, in other words, in the timing.
It sounds like it. And yet, when you hear Russian officials speaking, on television at various events, they say the line is, Russia wants peace, we're interested in peace, we're interested in continuing our contacts with the Americans. And that's actually a very interesting line, because I think it's clear that whatever happens on Ukraine with the Ukraine peace process, what the Russians want is to make sure that their contacts with America and their attempt to rebuild relations with America continues. We're seeing these two tracks. We're seeing talks on Ukraine, but we're also seeing Moscow and Washington talking about sort of restarting, rebuilding, repairing their relationship. There's talk about possible lucrative deals. Russia's been dangling all kinds of sort of golden carrots in front of Donald Trump. They're talking about boosting diplomatic links and getting things together. But the danger, I think, for Vladimir Putin here is that if Donald Trump starts to feel that he's being, led along here by the Russians, that that could endanger these efforts to kind of rebuild US-Russian relations. Up till now, most of the criticism that Donald Trump has expressed regarding the war in Ukraine has been directed at President Zelensky. We've seen that for months now. But however, as I've mentioned, we are now seeing critical comments, critical social media posts, critical remarks made on camera directed at Vladimir Putin. Now, I wonder whether this is going to change the way President Putin behaves or not.
And also in Trump's post on Truth Social after his meeting with Zelensky at the Vatican at the weekend, he sort of gave a clue as to if America did want to put more pressure on Russia, where those pressure points would be. He talked about the banking sector and so-called secondary sanctions. So there are other places where if Trump wanted to, he could put pressure on Russia and on the Russian economy.
In theory, yes. I mean, so far, this is all words, isn't it? We've seen real pressure being exerted by the White House on Ukraine. We haven't seen so far real pressure being exerted on the Kremlin. Donald Trump has said that pressure is being put on Russia, but we haven't seen any of it. But you're right, he did mention banking sanctions. I mean, there are already lots of banking sanctions against Russia. But he has mentioned before secondary tariffs on Russian oil, on countries that buy Russian oil and other sort of Russian natural resources. And would he go ahead with that? It's possible. I think, he says one thing one day, another thing the next. So it's very difficult and perhaps not too accurate to kind of hone in on one comment, one thing that's said, because tomorrow he could be saying something completely different. But it is interesting. The Russians do seem to be reacting to critical comments coming from Washington. The 30-hour ceasefire, then this 3-day ceasefire. So it's going to be interesting over the next few days to see whether that is going to affect what Russia does.
And it seems like there's been a bit of an update, at least from what Russia claims is going on in the Kursk region. So that bit of territory that Ukraine invaded and occupied last year. And there's been fighting there ever since. And now the Russians are claiming that they've captured the whole thing, while also acknowledging for the first time the help of North Korean military personnel. What's your take on what's going on there?
Yeah, I find this quite remarkable, actually, because now that the Russians have claimed to have recaptured all of Kursk region, the worst kept secret is now being revealed, that North Korean soldiers actually helped the Russians. Russian officials didn't say much about North Korean troop soldiers until now. And suddenly we're seeing pictures of North Korean soldiers training and down in southern Russia. I find it remarkable because all of this is being presented as victory in the Russian media. In the Russian papers today, the word victory, I saw that several times, victory to describe Russia regaining control over its territory. And yet there was no mention in any of the papers that if Vladimir Putin had not launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there would not have been a Ukrainian incursion into Russia's Kursk region. And Russia would not have had to spend more than 250 days trying to regain its own territory. And yet now they've apparently done this. It's being portrayed in the media as a huge victory for Russia.
And Steve, I mean, the last thing we saw in terms of direct engagement with Putin was Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's kind of emissary for lots of parts of the world, going to the Kremlin at the end of last week. What was your just interpretation of the body language and the smiles and like the mood between those two? They seem to be getting on very well.
Yeah, I mean, it was their fourth meeting this year, I think, or since February. And, Steve Witkoff walked in there like Putin's best friend. Big smile on his face. I think one of the Russian papers today described Steve Witkoff's smile as a radiant smile. And smiles mean dialogue, the paper said. But yes, they certainly met as the best of friends. The most interesting thing for me about that meeting was the table, actually, because on one side of the table you had, the might of the Russian delegation. You had Vladimir Putin in the middle. You had Mr. Ushakov, his foreign policy aide. You had Kirill Dmitriev, President Putin's envoy, and an interpreter. On the other side of the table, you just had Steve Witkoff, an interpreter. And he even seems a bit surprised to see the interpreter. So this is not traditional diplomacy. It's not 5 on one side, 5 on another, or 3 on one side, 3 on another. It was very one-sided. This is not normally how things are done. But then, Steve Witkoff is not a traditional diplomat, is he? He's a billionaire real estate developer who has had more face time with Vladimir Putin, surely, than any other American this year. Quite an interesting relationship. And of course, a couple of meetings back, it was Vladimir Putin who passed to Steve Witkoff that present for Donald Trump, the portrait of Donald Trump with his fist in the air, which Steve Witkoff took back to Washington and gave to Donald Trump, and reportedly Donald Trump was very pleased with it. I met the artist, actually, at the end of last week.
Oh, no way.
The artist who painted that portrait. Yeah. We went to his studio in Moscow, and he said that he got a phone call afterwards from Vladimir Putin thanking him for what he'd done, for painting the picture, and saying he'd done something very important. So he said to me that he was very pleased to have played a little role in improving US-Russian relations.
I'm just thinking back to that when we learned about that portrait, and it was one of those moments where, okay, Putin is presented sometimes as a sort of like supervillain in the media narrative, but supervillains can also be capable of like immense flattery and sucking up to people as well.
Oh, I think Vladimir Putin knows which buttons to press when it comes to Donald Trump, but then lots of world leaders do, right? Some world leaders offer second state visits, don't they, to Donald Trump. Some world leaders hand over portraits of Donald Trump. Some world leaders go and play golf with Donald Trump. So everyone's trying to find their own way to the heart and mind of the US president.
Well, Steve, thank you very much for filling our minds with good analysis as usual.
Thanks, Adam. Take care.